Maybe to bring it down to St. Francis, I'll read you a passage, not that you need to have the passage read to you, but I'll read you a passage from the beginning of Francis's, what's known as his earlier rule. And it starts this way. This is the life of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which Brother Francis asked the Lord Pope to be granted and confirmed for him. The rule and life of these brothers is to live in obedience, in chastity, and without anything of their own, and to follow the teaching and the footprints of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I wonder if that injunction to follow the teaching and footprints, the footsteps of our Lord Jesus Christ, has something to say about the Franciscan way of life as a whole, and maybe about Francis himself.
Yeah, well, I especially like that word footprints, the vestigia in Latin, because that's a word that occurs more than once, especially in the writings of the early Franciscans about Francis, etc. So if we think back of Francis's life is really interesting. He kind of undergoes a conversion while he's a prisoner in Perugia, when he's barely out of his teens, captured in one of these ridiculous civil wars that were constantly going on in Italy. And when after a year, his father manages to bond him out, and he's a different person. He begins to live on the margins of society. There were a lot of people that were doing that at the time. He wasn't sure how he began to literally build work on a church, to repair a church, which horrified people because he did not come from the working class. He was from the mercantile class, but he's actually working with his hands, which was unthinkable. And one day in church, he heard the gospel preached, in which Jesus enjoins his followers to give up everything, and to come follow me. And the early stories say that he was unsure that he heard it correctly. It had been read in Latin, and he didn't have a lot of education, so he asked the priest to read it to him again at the end of Mass. And then he said, that's what he decided he was going to do. He was going to completely live on the providence of God after the following of Christ. And even though you could never accuse Francis of being a systematic thinker, what you do see is out of that insight, he gets all kind of other insights into the meaning of Jesus. Everything from the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem to the crucifixion and death of Christ, which is replicated in the Stigmata. So he gets this idea that what I'm going to do is I'm going to live radically under the providence of God. I'm going to follow the naked Christ nakedly, as his biographers say, quoting St. Jerome. And this is what he starts to do. And there were a lot of kind of crazy movements going on in the 13th century, early 13th century. So he goes to Rome to get the Pope to permit this way of life. He didn't want to be considered heterodox. And it's kind of granted to him, and he takes off. He gets some companions, and there wasn't much structure in the life. You read from the Rule of 1221. He had actually written an earlier rule, which we don't have, but which we think were just verses from the scriptures, little verses from the New Testament about how to live. And this rather improbable guy with this small group of vagrants begins to attract enormous numbers of people for reasons which are complex, but I think understandable.
So in terms of Francis himself, his early biographer, Thomas of Solano, talks about him as an alter Christus, a second Christ. So closely does Thomas believe that the life of St. Francis was configured to the life of Jesus, or so closely did he follow in those footsteps or vestigia? What's the idea operating here? How can we flesh that out a little bit more? That somehow St. Francis was a second Christ or an alter Christus?
Yeah, oftentimes when I've talked to students in my long career in the classroom, and every once in a while you run across a student that says, I'm a fundamentalist. I would always say to them, let me tell you about a guy who was a real fundamentalist. That was Francis of Assisi. I mean, he hears the gospel, and basically what he wants to do is to kind of replicate fundamentally, without any gloss, the pattern of Jesus' life himself. Jesus was a wandering preacher. I'm going to be a wandering preacher. Jesus, we have almost no autobiographical writings or comments of Francis, except his famous testament. And it's interesting what he says about his conversion in the opening lines of that testament. He said, when I was in the world, I could not bear the sight of lepers. And the Lord brought me to them, and I embraced them, and shortly thereafter, I left the world. That's an extraordinary statement. I mean, the mark of the Christian was the care for the leper. That's a theme that runs all through medieval spirituality. But Francis says, and I'm sure he had in mind Jesus healing the lepers, that to be able to embrace the leper is to be able to love unconditionally, and if Jesus is going to do that, I'm going to do that. Wow. I think that's a very important thing. But could I give you some other examples?
Absolutely.
In 1223, he's in a little pokey town in Umbria, Greccio, and it's time for Christmas. And so he says, well, this Christmas we're going to celebrate Mass, not in the church, but in a stall, in a barn. And there's a beautiful passages in the early stories about Francis, and he says, so this is where it's going to be. He says, because I want people to understand the poverty in which Christ was born. It's commonly said that the whole custom of Christmas cribs that we have, creches, really dates from 1223 when Francis first does this by kind of acting out the infancy of Christ in the stable in Bethlehem and whatnot. Now the big insight that Francis gets is the fact that this was the Son of God who was being born. So this is just not some great man. This is just not another Socrates or something. This is the Son of God. And in Francis's mind, that always said the unutterable majesty of God became flesh. The Word became flesh in a helpless baby. Later in one of his admonitions, Francis says, he links that idea to the idea of the Eucharist. He said, Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. That is, he is really present in the Eucharist the same way that divinity was in the birth of this child in Bethlehem, which you can duplicate. So he, by performance and by faith and by seeing, he's attempting to become like another Christ. The word that you see in the Latin stories of Francis, the early legends of Francis, the stories that were read out loud and whatnot, they like to use the word conform in the technical sense that he wanted to take on the form of Jesus. I don't want to go on a great length about this, but you could sort of say that what Francis is doing is exegeting the scriptures not by writing commentaries, but by living them out.
Wow.
I think St. Bonaventure.
Performing them.
Performing them, yeah.